great cathedral in Rochdale, England. Sir John Barbarelli, was conducting a symphony orchestra on a Friday evening. That Friday evening, the vast hall was filled to capacity. There was no place for anyone else to sit or stand. It was completely filled. At the end of the concert, as the crowd was filing out, a young man stopped and talked to the minister of that particular church. And he asked him, "When are you going to have this place this full on a Sunday?" And the minister, without even batting an eye, said, "I shall have this place this full on a Sunday when, like Sir John Barbarelli, I have under me 80 trained and disciplined men." Perhaps the greatest threat to the growth of the church has been the development of a quote-unquote clergy and a quote-unquote laity. Now, I know we don't normally use those words here in our fellowship and all, but by whatever name you want to call it, the ministers and the members, or however you want to phrase it and term it, either explicitly or implicitly, there has developed over the years since the first century a core of religious professionals who apparently do all of the major and important work in the church. And then there is the crowd of religious onlookers whose sole duty, it appears, to be to look at the one's professional ministry type people and criticize them. But Jesus didn't come to establish a clergy and a laity, or a class of ministers and members. He didn't come to do that, to establish a group of theological specialists. It never was his intention that a few people take religion seriously while the many others sort of just dabble in it on Sundays. Jesus came to call disciples. He didn't come to establish those specialists over here so that they could do all of the work. He came to call disciples. There was never in his mind a place or a room for an entire class of religious people who enjoyed all of the benefits of the kingdom without shouldering any of the responsibilities. Religion to Jesus was never intended to be a spectator sport. It was never intended by Jesus that people just sit in pews on Sunday morning and then they get up and they walk out and it doesn't impact their lives in the least. That was not his intention. That was not Jesus' plan. Now, normally, when we think of being a disciple of Jesus, 12 men come to mind. But while those 12 men were disciples, they were followers of Jesus, they were a special class of disciple. They were apostles. And there's a difference, and we'll look at that difference in a few moments. What I want us to do is to spend this week and the next few weeks as we work towards and build up to our Neighbor Day. And if you don't understand why I'm calling it Neighbor Day instead of Friends Day this year, read the bulletin, front page, tell you all about it, okay? So while we're building up to our Neighbor Day, exploring what it means to be a serious and a sincere disciple of Jesus. You see, far too often we think that discipleship simply means following on Sunday or following Jesus on our own terms. What we're going to look at on Friends Day, August the 26th. By the way, there are invitations that you can hand out on the table in the foyer. I encourage you to hand those out to everyone that you know. But August 26th again, Neighbor Day. But we're going to build up to that, talking about what it means to be a serious and sincere disciple of Jesus. Because you see, when we fail to take discipleship seriously, and when we fail to be sincere in our commitment to Jesus, we strike at the very heart of Jesus' method for winning the world. The life of Jesus was a brilliant bonfire in the night. But you know, one tree of flame is no real cause for alarm. I mean, if a fire is contained, it will eventually burn itself out. It is the very nature of fire, however, to be contagious. One burning tree sparks another burning tree, sparks more burning trees until an entire forest is set ablaze. The great challenge of Jesus was passing on his fire. And to do that, he chose the method of discipleship. Thus, we begin this morning talking about the way of discipleship. We also share in his challenge. We must share in his method. But before we begin that, we need to understand that there are multiple sides to Jesus' ministry. We begin with the public aspect of Christ's ministry. And there was a public aspect to it. The Gospels speak of his public teaching in his ministry. Matthew, some examples of this would be Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, where the text tells us Jesus began to preach. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, as Jesus was going through Galilee, he was teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom. In Matthew chapters 5 through 7, we have what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus went up on a mountainside and he taught people. Matthew 9, verse 35, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 11, again we find Jesus preaching and teaching. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus preaches a sermon from a boat because the crowd was so big, it was pressing in on him. And so he gets into the boat and he gets out a little ways from the shore so that he could still teach them but not be crushed by them. Matthew chapters 21 through 23, Jesus preaches a sermon while he's in the temple. And that's just Matthew's gospel. Okay, the other three gospel accounts have other records of Jesus teaching the multitudes. The Gospels not only speak of him teaching with the crowds, but also the Gospels speak of his interaction with the crowds. He would teach them, but that wouldn't be the end of it. He would interact with them as well. In fact, the crowd is mentioned some 42 times in Matthew's Gospel alone. Twice, Jesus feeds crowds numbering in the thousands. 5,000 men plus women and children. 4,000 men plus women and children. And notice each of those times he starts by teaching them and he feeds them. Luke chapter 12, a crowd of many thousands came to hear Jesus speak. Consistently, there are not just crowds, but large crowds that came to hear Jesus and to listen to what he had to say. And Christians often have focused on this aspect of Christ's ministry, on the preaching and the crowds. We've marveled at his ability to draw crowds, and we have molded our efforts along the same lines. In some instances, so interested are we in drawing crowds that we don't care how we do it. We just want to have a lot of people. And so we've moved from instructing them about the ways of Christ and what Christ would have them know to entertaining them. And if we offer enough entertainment, then the crowds will come. And if the crowds are there, then that's all that really matters. Much of the focus of today's Christians is on the public proclamation of the Word. In fact, some folks think that as long as they show up on Sunday and they hear the sermon, then they're good. That's all they have to do, and they can walk out and not have it impact their lives. They don't have to worry about what they do Monday through Saturday because they were at church on Sunday morning. But you know, there was more than one side to Jesus' ministry. There was the public aspect of Christ's ministry with the crowds and the large gatherings and so forth, but there was also a private aspect of Christ's ministry and to his work. See, Jesus called individuals. In Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, we have the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, 4 individuals. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, we have the calling of Matthew, a tax collector. Nobody likes tax collectors. Nobody wanted a tax collector to follow it, but Jesus did. In John chapter 1, verse 43, we read of the calling of Philip. And then in Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19, we have something very interesting happening. Listen to what it says. And Jesus went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired. And they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. And then we go on to read about the names of the 12 apostles. But do you notice what's happening in there in this verse? There's a whole bunch of people. Jesus calls to him those he wants. He, we might say, separates unbelievers from the believers. And he calls the believers to him. He narrows from believers to disciples. He narrows from disciples to apostles. And ultimately in the apostles, he'll narrow from the 12 down to the 3 closest ones to him, Peter, James, and John. He's constantly moving from the public to the private, from the crowds to the individual. Jesus called individuals. And he called individuals to discipleship. Jesus had a purpose for calling these men to himself. They were to become fishers of men. They were to be partners in his work in the kingdom. They were to go into all the world and preach the gospel. But I want you to notice something. That last part, going into all the world and preaching the gospel, that comes at the very end of Jesus' ministry. After his death, burial, and resurrection is when he gives them the Great Commission. He didn't call them first to change the world. First, he called them to follow him and to learn. Follow and learn. Very simple. Follow me, Jesus says to these chosen ones. Spend time with me. Get to know me. Learn how I interact with people. Commit. Watch what I do. Listen to what I say. Be my disciples. Let me be your teacher. Follow after me. Commit yourselves to me and go where I go. See what I do. Jesus called individuals to discipleship. And notice when he did so, he didn't just leave them hanging as to what that meant. Jesus spent time with those he called, those he chose to be his disciple. He spent time with them. He took them along wherever he went. Now, with the exception of a few occasions where Jesus maybe spent the night alone in prayer, he seems to always have at least one of his apostles with him. He often would take them off by themselves. Mark 6 verse 31 says, "And Jesus said to them, 'Come away with me by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while.'" He takes them off by themselves because they were so busy with the demands of his ministry that they didn't even have time to eat. And Jesus was worried about them, so he calls them to come off by themselves. In Mark 9, verses 30 and 31, it says, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples," and what he was teaching them was about his forthcoming death, burial, and resurrection. So notice he had them with him everywhere he went, and he taught them privately, oftentimes. In fact, we just read Mark 9, 30 and 31, where he is teaching them quietly or privately about what's going to happen with him. Did you know, though, that 7 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew are devoted to teaching that Jesus gave to his disciples? Not to the crowds, to his disciples. 7 chapters in Matthew. By the way, there are 28 chapters in Matthew. So 1/4 of the Gospel of Matthew is about Jesus teaching his disciples, his followers. Those chapters are chapter 10, chapters 16 through 18, and chapters 24 through 26. John chapter 13 through 17 gives us an intimate portrayal of the teaching that Jesus did with these chosen few. Even some of his public teachings that he taught to the crowds were really geared toward his followers, towards his disciples. For example, Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It says, Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And he begins with the Beatitudes and goes on through the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount, while the crowds heard it, it was directed at his disciples. This private, individualized aspect of Christ's ministry cannot be ignored. It was as important a part of his work as was his public ministry and teaching and preaching. It would be difficult to imagine Jesus' ministry if you took away the emphasis he placed on calling a few, training them intensively, and preparing them to continue the work which he started. Why did Jesus dedicate so much of his time to the 12? In other words, why did Jesus make disciples? I want to give you 3 reasons. There are more, but these 3 reasons should suffice for our purposes. Number 1, because his work focused on people. Jesus' work and his ministry was about people. If you were going to change history, how would you go about doing it? I mean, just how would you do it? Jesus could have committed himself to writing words which would outlive him. He could have spent his entire life with paper and pen, writing down his truths for future generations. He could have done that, but you know, the only writing that Jesus ever did that we're told about, he wrote in dirt in John chapter 8. Not a very permanent medium. Though more words have been written about Jesus than any other person to have ever lived, not a one of them is autobiographical. Jesus could have spent his time writing, but he didn't. Jesus could have committed himself to establishing an institution which would outlive him. He could have organized the foundation and set up a corporation to continue his work when he was gone. Now, I know that he talked about setting up and establishing his church. But by his church, he didn't mean the well-oiled, closely managed, hierarchical structure we think of as an institution. Jesus left behind no charter to organize an institution, no bylaws, no name for it to be called, no administrative plan. But you know what he did do? He didn't spend his time writing. He didn't come up with this great business model for something that would outlive him. Instead, Jesus committed himself to people. The words of truth he came to give, he gave to people who would pass them on to others. The church he came to build, he entrusted to people who would build it, name it, and enlarge it. The ministry of Jesus was a ministry focused on changing people's lives, focused on making people disciples, focused on instilling in them a vision that would motivate them to write the words and build the church and change the world. Why did Jesus make disciples? Because his work, his ministry, his life focused on people. But also because his work had to go on. You know, a great danger the work of Jesus faced was that his work would end when his life ended at the cross. Many a great dream has often died with the dreamer. The great dream of Jesus may well have died when he did on the cross if he had been content to preach rather than teaching his disciples how to preach. The great dream of Jesus may well have died when he did if he had been content to do great things instead of challenging his disciples to do greater things than he. The great dream of Jesus may well have died when he did if he had been content for his ministry to remain his own rather than encouraging others to make that ministry their own. The only way to ensure continuance of his work was to make it the work and the obsession of his apostles. See, because Christ's work had to go on, the torch had to be passed, you might say. It had to be entrusted to faithful men who would in turn pass it on to others. Like 2 Timothy 2 verse 2 speaks of Paul giving that torch to Timothy, and Timothy is encouraged to train other men who will pass it on to others, and so forth. So the primary task of his life was making disciples who would continue his work after he was gone. Why did Jesus make disciples? Because his work focused on people. Because his work had to go on. And third, because his work had to go out. Another great danger the work of Jesus faced was that with his death, his work would become just another tiny local hiccup in the vastness of world history. That no one would ever remember it. Jesus never traveled very far from the place that he was born. His life was bound to one small corner of the world. He preached in towns like Capernaum, Bethany, and Bethsaida. Not in the major metropolitan areas of Rome and Athens and Ephesus. How in the world could Jesus turn the world upside down or right side up, depending on the way you want to look at it? How could he do that unless he developed people who would and could go into all the world and make disciples of all nations? How could he change the world without making people who could go into all that world and preach the gospel? See, because Christ's work had to go out, the torch had to be entrusted to faithful men who would and could travel where he had never been, who would and could speak where his voice had never been heard. So again, the primary task of his life was making disciples who could carry on his work after he was gone. But you know, we come to those two most important words in all of preaching. Two words that a professor of mine in college said that if he could, he would paint them on the back wall of every auditorium. Those two words are actually a question. So what? What difference does it make that Jesus made disciples? What difference does it make that that's how he chose in his generation to change the world? Well, so what? So the church today should make disciples. That should be our primary task and our primary objective. Why? Because we have the same work. And because we have the same work, we also must focus on people. You know, it's easy for us to focus on the programs or the institution or the doctrines. Ultimately, however, if we are not focused on changing people's lives, if we are not focused on calling people to follow Jesus, if we're not focused on instilling in them a vision that consumes them and transforms them, then all of that other stuff is pointless. We can attract the biggest crowds that can possibly be imagined. But if we don't teach them to follow Jesus on His terms, then we're just wasting our time. And worse than that, we're just giving them and ourselves false hope, because we can't follow Jesus on our terms and expect to receive His blessings. We have the same work. We also must focus on people. We also must pass the torch on. It's very possible that this work could die with us. It's very possible. It's very possible that the Eastgate Church of Christ in 15 or so years may no longer exist. That's a very pessimistic thing for you to say, preacher. Look around. Look at the age of our congregation. Not the church in Siloam Springs, the age of the members. If we don't start doing something, in less than 20 years, there's not going to be an Eastgate Church of Christ in Siloam Springs. And by doing something, I don't mean, having all the right programs and getting crowds of people in here and stuff like that. I'm talking about making disciples. If we aren't making disciples, if we don't start making disciples, this congregation will, in fact, cease to exist. If we're content to keep the work our own, rather than encouraging others to make it their work, then this congregation will die. People often say, well, Carl, wouldn't it be better if you did the devotionals on Wednesday night? I mean, you always do such a good job and blah, 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 so on and so forth. And you know what? The answer is no. No, because that gives other people an opportunity to learn about telling people about Jesus, sharing with people about Jesus and what He's done for them. That's good training. Because if they can stand up here and they can talk to you about that, then they can go out there and they can tell their friends about it. And they can go and tell the people that they work with the people that they go to school with. They can tell others about Jesus as well. We must pass the torch on. We have to make time for more than doing the work ourselves. We have to multiply the workers. We also must spread the word outward as well. It's very possible that this work will remain confined to this building, on this street corner, in this one little area, in this one little state. Again, if we're content to keep this work to ours rather than teaching others to make the work theirs, it will. If this work is to turn the world upside down, we don't need to do more work so much as we need more workers. And workers only come when we make disciples. We have the same work that Jesus had, so thus we must use and need the same methods. We need a public ministry designed to call people to discipleship. Through preaching and teaching, media work, campaigns, crowds and auditoriums, like this past week, Vacation Bible School. We have some of the kids that have been to VBS, have been for the past several years. Now, where they are the other 51 weeks of the year, we don't know. But they're here for that week. And in that week, we're planting seeds in them, hopefully, that one day will grow in their lives and in their parents' lives. That's why we do the Parents' Night. And that's why I encourage our members to be here on that Parents' Night, so you can meet them. And so that maybe You can take that public outreach that we've done and turn it into private ministry designed to make people disciples. You go from the church building to the fellowship room, to eating cookies and making conversation with them, to maybe setting up a time outside of the church building where you can meet with them and talk with them and share with them. And yes, make disciples of them. You do that by individuals and homes, training and sharing and spending time. So let me ask you a question. This morning, when you walk out those doors, are you going to be out making disciples, or are you just going to be out? See, the message of Jesus is not just for auditoriums on Sunday morning. The message of Jesus is for your plumbing shop. The message of Jesus is for the Walmart store. The message of Jesus is for the schools, whether the school acknowledges it or not. The message of Jesus is for everyone in every place. That's why we're going to talk about making disciples. Let me ask you another question. Are you His disciple? Have you been immersed in the watery grave of baptism, having your sins washed away, being raised to walk in a new life? If so, have you stayed faithful to the commitment that you've made? Have you remained His disciple? Or somewhere along the way, have you been sidetracked? If that describes you, then you need to make things right between you and God. Maybe that involves a private response where you're at. Maybe it involves a public response. Whatever that response is, respond. Make things right before it's too late. If we can help you to do that through a public response for baptism, prayer, or in some other way, then why don't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together.